Hi there. In this lecture we see a fascinating and very exciting game of Wilhelm Steinitz against Philip Meitner. This is an 1860, a casual game actually, but a very instructive one. E4, E5, it starts off with this move order, the Scotch game, but we get a position of interest here because bishop c4, bishop c5. Now you might wonder, well, how is this relevant, Kingscrusher? Well, I'll show you, because we could have had this move order with our classic Italian game move, and black played bishop c5 and d4, and lo and behold, we get exactly the same position as in this game. If black plays e takes d4, black does have other options. So this is the Rosentratter gambit. This is a rarer alternative to the Evans gambit, much smaller game sample sizes, but statistically, yeah, it is doing a little bit better actually than the Evans gambit, but it is a much smaller sample size. So the Evans gambit is a lot more established than this, and used rather than this Rosentratter gambit. So yeah, we can get it from here. E takes d4. If bishop takes d4, according to modern engines, actually we're about even if we take on d4 and play bishop e3. This is very interesting, kind of novel territory. If knight takes d4, we can play bishop e3 here, and actually this situation, for example, is also about even. So it's fascinating. So anyway, so let's go to the key position. So e takes d4. This is the key position. Now if they play e takes d4, it becomes the Haxo gambit. H-A-X-O. So we have bishop c4, bishop c5, and now castling is actually an inaccuracy. So we should play here c3, a bit like a Smith-Morra gambit, c3, trying to accelerate the knight development. But if d takes is not about developing the knight, we just have the classic, what would you play for 10 points? Bishop takes f7 check, because there's an unprotected piece on c5, which we can tap into and exploit here with advantage, big advantage. So let's assume they play the more sensible move, knight f6. Then we can play c takes d4, and the resulting situation should be about even here. Here we rely on a tactic because there's an unprotected piece on b4. Can you see what that tactic is for 10 points? Yeah, bishop takes f7 check, then queen b3 check. The resulting situation after queen e7 here, which sets up some discovered checks, we should really take the queen, and it's just an even position. So anyway, c3 is technically the best move, but in this game we have Steinitz castling. Now knight f6 is actually not just an inaccuracy where white is actually technically better, it's also a transposition now into the Scotch gambit and the so-called max LANGE attack. So we've gone into that by transposition. If d6 had been played, we're still in the Haxo gambit territory, and note that it puts the brakes in, it tries to discourage e5. This position, for example, we're still in the Haxo gambit territory, and black still has a small edge. So actually this is a bad transposition move. It's a position which now favours white. We have e5, d5. E takes f6, d takes c4. Rook e1 check, bishop e6. So here, Steinitz goes with knight g5. In fact, what we can do here is the greedy looking f takes g7. In this particular position, this is quite good for white. So as example, bishop g5, and let's say bishop e7 we can take, and then take on d4 here. And this is actually possible. If castling, we can now play a very cute move. Can you see what it is? Knight takes c6. Even though we're pinned, it seems, we're attacking the opponent's queen. It's with check. So they should really take on c6. If they take on d1, we're taking with check and then taking the rook after with a material advantage. So they take on c6, queen f3, rook takes g7, and we have a significant advantage here. Positionally, look at that wreck of a pawn structure. So knight g5 though was played instead of f takes g7. So of course there are other variations, but let's just go with the game here. Queen d5 is actually very accurate to equalise. Knight c3 is a good move for white in the circumstance. So if d takes, we just play queen takes d5 and the bishop's pinned. So queen f5. Now here, white can actually persist with a small edge with knight c to e4, because it sets up an idea that, look, we're actually threatening potentially g4. If the queen ever moves, we can maybe take on c5. So this is the key move here, which seems better than the game actually. So in the game, g4 was played just to illustrate knight c to e4, because we're interested in the theory of the opening in particular here. So knight takes e6, f takes, and g4 is actually possible here. So if queen g6, we can actually first take on g7, then take on c5, and we're holding a big advantage here. If queen e5, we get a small advantage, so f takes, and then just hold on to the g7 pawn with bishop h6. And this position, it seems a bit scary because that bishop's active at the moment, c3. Let's say rook d7, we can take that bishop out, and queen f3, and we get a position which is a small advantage for white overall. So anyway, knight c4, c to e4 does seem a good move, but g4 was played. We have queen takes f6, which is actually a big mistake. If queen g6 had been played, let's look at this position for a moment. The bishop drops back, has time to drop back, and let's say f4, d3 check, bishop e3, black castles. We can play f5, and black can sack the bishop there, and overall black is actually better here. We're in a precarious situation with a weakened king. Overall black is better. Black has all 8 pawns, we're down to 5 pawns. So yeah, black is actually better overall. Yeah, it's quite interesting to try and evaluate this position. Okay, so anyway, queen f6 though was played, which does Steinitz a big favour, because now guess what we have? Yeah, knight d5. We have knight d5 with tempo on the queen. Queen d8. If queen g6 here, we just take on e6, and then actually, can you see what white has here for 10 points? A nice little tactic. Yeah, rook takes e6 check, we can win the queen. Knight takes c7 check, and knight takes e6. So queen d8 was played. Now, this does remind me a bit of a Morphy game, but it's a much improved version of events for the same kind of exchange sacrifice which occurs now. Yeah, so you might be able to guess it. Rook takes e6 here is actually very, very accurate. F takes, knight takes e6. So queen d7 is played. The knight on d5 is immune because we play knight takes c7 check. See that weakness of the last move? Always try and observe the weaknesses of the last move. So that's an invitation to take on c7, then take on queen. So queen d7 was played. And now queen e2 does the job. It is a good advantage for white. There's even better here, actually, with knight d takes c7 check. And the idea is not to win the rook. It's about taking out escape squares of the king. So say king f7, knight g5 check, king g8. Here, yeah, sure, we can take on a8. Now that the rooks are disconnected, we can safely take on a8. And the other point is, if the king had gone to e7 instead, then actually, can you see a super powerful move here? Non-greedy on this occasion, because the rooks are connected. As a general rule, do we want to take on a8? Or is there an advantage, instead of taking on a8, that we're controlling quite a few escape squares of the king here? So what do we want to do? Yeah, and also we're controlling we're providing support on d5. The move is really nice here. That is queen f3. It's got this big threat of bishop g5, and if the king, goes to d6, then we've got queen d5 supported by the knight. So that's the big threat. Say this move, we can play it anyway. Rook f6. and then actually forget taking material, rook e1. And it's a pretty crushing position. Knight takes c5 check. Bishop takes f6 check. It's a really crushing position. Yeah, black's in a world of pain here. Okay, so yeah, it does seem as though knight d takes c7 check is more accurate. But okay, queen e2. We have this disaster move, bishop e7. It's a real disaster move, bishop e7. Actually, if king f7, knight g5 check, the king could go to g8. We could take on c7 here. This is a nice tactic. So if queen takes c7, what would be the tactical idea here for 10 points? The tactical idea is actually queen takes c4 check, then knight e6 to win the queen, not queen e6 check, because king f8, and look, we've used up the e6 square. It sort of takes away resources when we occupy a square. It takes away options. So we want to keep our options on e6 square open here with queen takes c4 check, and so that let the knight use e6 for that lovely fork. So anyway, yeah, so king f7, yeah, the principal variation though, here, d3, and then this situation, knight d4, after c3, h6, let's just follow this through, this line, knight takes a4, queen takes d4, it ends up being still an advantage for white after all that. It's still an advantage for white in any case. So anyway, so that's king f7, but bishop e7 is actually worse than that, because now we have knight d takes c7 check, and the king is driven to the right hand side of the board because we're taking out the d8 escape square. The king has to go to f7 now, unless the queen wants to give herself up. And here, queen takes c4 is actually setting up a mate in 3 threat. So just to show you, if a6, can you see a mate in 3 here? Yeah, knight g5 is double check, so it forces the king to move. Then queen f7 check. And actually, because we've got that pawn on g4, we've got support for the h5 square, a bit unusual. Queen h5 is checkmate. So, okay, black plays knight e5. Now, this is actually a really powerful move, actually. Black has, for this moment, a good piece on e5, which safeguards the black position. This is a really accurate, well-calculated move. It's for good reason that Steinitz was world champion for quite some time. A very, very good, accurate player on many occasions. And here, you know, for 100 points, what would you play here? It's queen b3. Yeah, I like celebrating quiet moves sometimes. If we go with the loud move, we're not doing anything here, even though it's double check. With that knight on e5, this is a very different circumstance when white has to deal with this knight on e5. Look, we haven't got access to f7 because of that knight on e5 hitting our queen and defending an f7. It's a bit of an octopus knight here, and we lose time. And then bishop takes g5 happens, and then queen takes g4 happens, and we're left with absolutely nothing, which is why queen b3 is so good, because actually what we want to do here is first nudge this knight. Once we nudge this knight, everything will work again. This is a temporary octopus knight. So after queen d6, guess what Steinitz plays here, which is a brilliant follow-up. It's basically queen b3 acknowledges, look, the knight for this moment is holding everything, but, yeah, now what do we play? f4. Just kick this pesky knight out of e5. Knight takes g4 is played. If knight g6, then we're back to fun and games. You know, knight g5 check. We've got f7 without it being covered. That's a double check. And then queen f7 is mate. So knight takes g4. But now, yeah, now that the knight's not an octopus defensive knight, knight g5 double check. King g6. And here, this is a very accurate approach. Now, it's tempting. The g4 pawn has been taken. There's no support on h5. So actually we switch to queen d3 check. This by force is winning material. You know, we can see that at minimum knight e4 is winning the queen there. So the king goes to h5, check, and then we take out the g4 knight. We have now queen b6, which actually walks into a mate in 3. If queen takes c7, we have knight, well, at minimum, knight e6 check and win the queen at minimum. But this walks into a mate in 3. Do you want to pause the video and work out the mate in 3? Yeah, and I like setting you these tactical puzzles, and it's good tactics training. If we were studying a much more positional opening, we'd hardly get all of these tactics all of the time. Our tactical training opportunities would be limited. But yeah, there's like loads and loads of implied tactical puzzles, you know, from this gambit variation. So knight g to e6 check is a forced mate in 3. So king f6. And now, what would you play? 10 points. Well, actually, queen g5 was played. Queen takes g7. there's king f5. So that is a delay a bit. So actually queen g5 was played. So yeah, queen takes g7 was super tempting. But queen g5, and now it's just queen takes g7 is checkmate. So okay, it's a really fun game. It does imply actually by our move order, this is the Rosentratter gambit if we play with our Italian game move order. So it is an interesting side gambit as a surprise weapon. Yeah, this is quite fascinating. That d4 is an interesting surprise gambit with reasonable accuracy to it. You know, even from an engine perspective, because if bishop takes d4, the engines are evaluating this as about equal. We do get a valuable dark square bishop to play with here, with good compensation on d5 as well. And this position, yeah, it's an interesting position. This is about even. So, yeah, when it was accepted, this is the Haxo gambit. And sure, if black plays precisely here, black will get a small edge with d6 first. So what black did was this horrible transposition into maybe what looks to be familiar territory. But actually, this is a bad version of what it might look familiar with. This is actually a bad version of things. White is definitely with a big advantage here, and there was even the improvement for white here. F takes g7. So yeah, this is a very dangerous system indeed for white. So yeah, this is after knight f6. This is the feared Max Lange attack by transposition. So e5 here. Very dangerous position for black. Okay. Thanks very much. Hi there. I hope you enjoyed that game sample. It's actually from my course, which you can find at the Kingscrusher TV page, which has great discounts. It's the Italian game Mastery, the Ideal Beginner's Opening. So just very briefly, if we click there, you can also see other free sample videos. Just do expand all sections, and you can see these preview links if you want to see other free previews and get an idea of the course yourself. I'm going to keep it short here, just basically to say I had a fantastic time seeing many brilliant games in the Italian game. You can see from the number of collections how epic some of these games are, that they've been collected like hundreds of times at chessgames.com. And yeah, I really hope you check out this index and may consider getting the course. Okay. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.